When Jasmine Kensington disappeared into the vast primeval stretches of the Appalachian wilderness in early September of 2017, her brother assumed she'd be back in just a few days. That was the plan. She had promised him, but those weathered mountains, old as time itself, offered no return. She simply vanished, leaving behind no footprints, no gear, not a single shred of evidence, just silence. For 6 long years, rescue teams, local authorities, and even volunteers scoured the dense forest with growing desperation, yet found nothing. Her intended route through the thick green canopy remained as much a mystery as her fate. Then, in the autumn of 2023, a curious group of adventurers exploring a rarely documented ridge stumbled upon something that defied explanation. A strange, rhythmic electromagnetic signal emanating from a narrow, easily missed cave mouth hidden behind mossy underbrush. What they uncovered would shake every assumption made in Jasmine's case and ignite new questions stranger than anything the original investigation had ever considered. The Appalachian Mountains don't merely conceal secrets, they obliterate them. And by Tuesday, September 19, 2017, the absence of Jasmine's voice had grown into a roar of silence that no one could ignore any longer. For her older brother, Andrew, that Tuesday felt like a cruel loop of mounting anxiety. He cycled through the same anxious habits hour after hour, refreshing his phone screen, checking signal strength, hoping for the appearance of a simple message. Made it out, filthy but alive. But there was nothing. Only the mocking stillness of a blank display. Jasmine had promised she would check in no later than Monday afternoon. She was supposed to hike out, reach the closest area with reception, and send him a message, followed by one of her usual energetic calls, full of stories, laughter, the breathless joy she always brought back from her time in the wild. But now it was Tuesday evening, and that silence had become something heavy and unnatural, a pressure he could feel in his chest. He tried to comfort himself with logic. Jasmine was 32 years old. She was not just capable, she was experienced. A devoted outdoors woman. She'd tackled challenging trails before. Maybe she twisted her ankle and needed time. Maybe she had to reroute due to flooded trails or took a wrong turn and was correcting her course. That's all. But the more he repeated these comforting possibilities, the more fragile they sounded. Hollow mantras trying to patch a widening gap of dread. This trip was unlike the others. Jasmine had gone solo. Originally, she was supposed to hike with Nathan Caldridge, a colleague and close friend from her architecture firm. Their friendship had grown from long conversations about their mutual frustration with city life and a shared yearning for untamed places. During lunch breaks, they would lay out maps across the office table, tracing ridges and valleys with their fingers, dreaming of a 5-day adventure that would test their limits and refresh their souls. But the evening before departure, Nathan had called, barely able to speak. He was bedridden, ravaged by a sudden gastrointestinal virus. He was heartbroken to cancel but could barely stand. Andrew had immediately suggested that Jasmine delay the trip, reschedule for a week later, perhaps longer, but she was steadfast. She'd booked the time off work, something increasingly rare, and the idea of remaining in her apartment, surrounded by the gray hum of city life, was unbearable to her. She had to go. The pull of those misty hills had become a fixation since a short hike she and Andrew had taken just 2 weeks before. That day she'd been entranced by the rolling, emerald expanse, green layered upon green, timeless and wild. She had spoken of it constantly since, so she packed her equipment, double-checked her route, and reassured her brother she'd be fine. She promised to stick to their planned path and reminded him she always left detailed itineraries. Then, with confidence in her stride and anticipation in her heart, she drove off. By Wednesday morning, Andrew's uneasy thoughts had solidified into something far more urgent: fear, a tightening in his gut that no reasoning could suppress. He called the county sheriff's office. The dispatcher who answered spoke with practiced calm, But Andrew's own voice quivered slightly as he relayed every detail. Her name, Jasmine Kensington, 32 years old. Brown hair, athletic build. The make and color of her car, a charcoal gray sedan. The exact trailhead where she planned to begin her hike. It was an isolated spot, accessible only by a gravel road that wound deep into the forest, far from cell towers and well-traveled paths. Later that day, the call came back. A ranger had driven up to check the area. The parking lot at the trailhead was almost empty, except for one car. Jasmine's sedan sat beneath the sprawling limbs of an old oak, its windshield glazed with dust and pollen. A soft coating that spoke of days spent untouched. That discovery twisted Andrew's relief into dread. She had made it there. She had entered the woods. But she hadn't come back. That meant she had now been missing for 5 full days in a wilderness known for both its breathtaking beauty and its ruthless indifference. The official missing persons report was filed that same day. Andrew immediately sent the authorities the most recent photo he had of his sister, taken during their hike together just 2 weeks before. In it, Jasmine is perched on the thick, mossy limb of a gnarled tree. Her face is lit up by a wide, honest smile, the kind that radiates inner peace. She wears a bright cobalt blue jacket, her orange cap pushed back slightly to reveal strands of chestnut-brown hair, and a heavy hiking pack rests snugly on her back. The image was once a simple memory of a perfect day. Now it had become a search tool. Her portrait was the face of a mystery unraveling by the hour. Authorities wasted no time. By Thursday morning, the command post was operational. It sprang up like a temporary fortress at the edge of that gravel lot. Jasmine's car stood like a solemn guardian beside rows of white tents and fold-out tables covered with detailed topographic maps. The air buzzed with radio chatter, dispatch codes, and distant helicopter blades. State troopers, local deputies, and veteran park rangers coordinated logistics under a foggy sky that kept the valleys below cloaked in gray. Search teams deployed at first light. These were seasoned professionals, men and women who had tracked lost hikers, rescued the stranded, and, sometimes, recovered the fallen. They knew the terrain intimately, understood its dangers. They combed the trails methodically, examining not only the beaten path but the edges, where rhododendron bushes thickened into impassable walls, where creek beds dipped sharply, their banks slick with rotting leaves, and where the trees grew so close together that the sun barely touched the ground. Every shadow held possibility, every silence a question. The search teams advanced with a plan as precise as it was desperate, basing their movements on the route Jasmine had carefully described to her brother before she vanished. They began at the trailhead where her dusty sedan still sat in mute testimony, then slowly fanned outward. Their approach was disciplined, primary teams following the main trail, while smaller, more nimble groups peeled off to scour adjacent ridges, narrow hollows, drainage ditches, and ravines. These were the hidden folds of the land, places where a lone hiker might stumble, fall, and vanish entirely from view. By the second day, the scale of the operation had grown dramatically. Search and rescue, SAR units from 3 neighboring counties arrived, some in rugged off-road vehicles, others on foot with gear slung over their shoulders. They brought their own blend of professionalism, experience, and determination. With them came trained K-9 units. At the makeshift command post, dog handlers knelt beside their German shepherds and bloodhounds, offering them a scent article, a T-shirt retrieved from Jasmine's apartment, sealed in a plastic bag to preserve the trace of her unique smell. Once unleashed onto the trail, the dogs pulled with intensity, their noses sweeping the ground like pendulums, eager and alert. But only minutes into the pursuit, the trail abruptly faded. Within a few hundred yards of the parking lot, the scent was lost to the damp, chaotic scentscape of the Appalachian forest floor. The environment was too complex, too saturated. It was like trying to follow a single thread through a tapestry woven of moisture, decay, and time. Above, the low hum of a state police helicopter echoed through the valley. its rotor blades slicing the misty air. On board, spotters leaned against the glass, peering through high-powered binoculars and thermal imaging gear, scanning for anything out of place in the dense expanse below. But in late summer, the forest was an unbroken canopy, a thick ceiling of green that obscured everything beneath. To the crew up there, searching was like trying to pick out a single trembling leaf in a sea of millions. Andrew Kensington remained a fixture at the command post. He didn't roam far, choosing instead to anchor himself near the folding tables and maps. He brought coffee he couldn't stomach and a box of donuts he never touched, a small, almost ceremonial gesture of gratitude for the people searching for his sister. He listened intently as Frank Miller, a veteran ranger with 30 years of patrolling this wilderness, laid out the day's strategy. Frank's hands hovered over the maps, drawing lines through valleys and circling likely locations with a red marker. His voice was steady, grounded, but Andrew could read the enormity of what those simple marks represented. The topographical lines on paper belied the brutal complexity of the terrain: vertical climbs, hidden gullies, rocks slick as glass, and dense, disorienting brush. With each passing hour, Andrew felt as if time itself were bearing down on his shoulders. Days blurred into one another. After a full week, the exhaustive effort had uncovered absolutely nothing. No footprints, no torn fabric, no dropped gear. Not even a speck of trash. Something as mundane as a candy wrapper gave evidence that Jasmine had been there. The search crews were leaving more traces of their presence than she had. The initial energy that had filled the camp, the buzzing radios, the barking dogs, the urgency of hope, slowly settled into a quiet, grinding determination. Until, on the 8th day, hope flared. A call broke through the static of the radio, clear and urgent. A volunteer team had found something. They were several miles east of Jasmine's intended route, struggling through a treacherous swamp, thick with brambles and choked with vines. The voice of the team leader cracked slightly with emotion. They had discovered a fragment of bright fabric, a torn piece of turquoise material caught on the thorns of a branch overhanging a muddy creek bed. The color was almost identical to Jasmine's hiking jacket, as seen in the photo circulated to every search team. Instantly, the mood at the command center changed. A current of adrenaline rippled through the entire operation. Frank Miller sprang into action, redirecting manpower and resources. This might be the break they had prayed for. 2 elite tracking teams set out toward the new location, joined by a forensics deputy trained in evidence collection. The helicopter, which had been circling the broader perimeter, veered east to provide aerial coverage of the site. Andrew's heart pounded as he watched the flurry of movement. For the first time in days, he felt the sharp, almost painful rise of real hope. They had found something tangible, proof that Jasmine had passed through that area. And yet, the location troubled him. It was remote, off course. It suggested something had gone terribly wrong. Had she been lost, chased, injured? Searchers pushed into the area with renewed determination, but the terrain fought them at every step. The swamp was thick and unforgiving. Ankle-deep mud pulled at their boots. Insects swarmed every patch of exposed skin, and the thorny underbrush tore at their clothing. Still, they pressed on, expanding their search in widening circles from the spot where the fabric had been discovered. For 2 days, they battled the environment, praying for a second clue. But it never came. At the end of the 2nd day, the fragment was returned to base in a sealed evidence bag. Under the pale glow of a magnifying lamp, Frank Miller and an investigator studied it closely. The color matched, but something was off. The fabric was too coarse, too heavy. It lacked the high-performance weave of Jasmine's outdoor gear. Frank narrowed his eyes and pinched the material between calloused fingers. He had seen this before. It wasn't a hiking jacket at all. It was from an old fishing vest, a mass-produced item popular a decade ago, the kind often left behind during forgotten weekend trips. Just trash, nothing more. The revelation landed like a hammer. The time, the resources, the hope, they had all been wasted on a phantom. The morale of the teams, already frayed, plummeted. The collective spirit sagged under the weight of that false lead. And then the weather turned. A large, slow-moving system rolled in from the west, blanketing the mountains with a steady, icy rain. For 3 consecutive days, the trails became slick rivers of mud. The creeks surged into dangerous, roaring channels. Fog rolled down from the peaks, cloaking the ridgelines and grounding the helicopter indefinitely. What had been a difficult operation was now becoming dangerous, not just for the missing, but for the searchers themselves. Slips, falls, and exposure loomed as real threats. On the 14th day, Frank sat across from Andrew at one of the folding tables beneath a sagging tarp, his expression solemn. He laid it out plainly. Over 100 square miles of the most grueling terrain in the region had been searched. Every resource they had was exhausted. The single lead had been thoroughly investigated and debunked. With worsening weather and no fresh clues, the decision had been made. The large-scale search operation was being suspended. Frank's voice was gentle but firm. This wasn't an ending, he said. The case would remain open. Rangers and deputies would stay vigilant. Tips would still be followed. But the massive, coordinated ground effort, the one that had brought dozens of people together in a unified push, was over. With heavy hearts and weather-beaten faces, the volunteers began to break down the temporary village they had erected in the gravel lot. The fatigue from 2 relentless weeks of searching was carved into their expressions. Exhaustion not just from the physical labor, but from the weight of hope slowly turning into resignation. Tent poles were folded, cots stowed, tarps rolled into tight bundles. Coolers were emptied, radios shut off, and equipment packed away in a silent, mechanical ritual. One by one, the trucks and law enforcement vehicles rumbled down the dirt road, their tires grinding against loose stone, their brake lights glowing through the morning mist. Soon the lot stood mostly empty again, save for one enduring relic of the ordeal, Jasmine Kensington's charcoal gray sedan. It remained under the same oak tree, alone again, its dusty windshield untouched. A silent sentinel. A painful reminder that despite all efforts, she had not returned to it. In the weeks that followed, the official operation might have ceased, but the human will to find her lingered. For several weekends afterward, smaller, informal search parties emerged. Friends of Jasmine, acquaintances, and even complete strangers who had followed the story online came out to walk the trails, comb through ravines, and peer under fallen logs, refusing to let her simply disappear without a trace. But their numbers were smaller, their organization lost. And as September melted into October, and the autumn chill began to bite the mornings, fewer and fewer came. The trees began their transformation, shedding their green canopies in bursts of amber, crimson, and gold. The forest floor became a tapestry of fallen leaves, rustling softly underfoot and hiding whatever clues might still have remained. In this new layer of decay, any evidence of Jasmine's presence, any footprint or scrap of clothing, was buried deeper still. And with each passing day, the wilderness grew quieter. The Appalachian mountains, ancient and indifferent, resumed their usual rhythm. They swallowed Jasmine Kensington like they had swallowed so many before her, leaving behind no explanation, no goodbye. Only a photograph taped to a search board and a long list of questions that twisted through the minds of those she left behind. 2 years passed. In that time, grief mutated for Andrew Kensington. What had begun as panic, sharp, frantic, searing, transformed into something slower and more corrosive. A chronic ache, always there but duller now. Jasmine's absence had seeped into the architecture of his life, altering its very foundation. The apartment she had loved was eventually emptied, her lease quietly terminated. Andrew had been the one to box her possessions, her books, camping gear, and the quirky knickknacks she kept on her kitchen shelves. They now sat in labeled plastic bins stacked in the corner of his garage, untouched. A silent archive of a life left on pause. The world, ever indifferent, moved on. Her co-workers grieved, then adapted. The architectural firm eventually hired a new associate. Her nameplate was removed from the office door, her inbox deleted. Time smoothed over her disappearance like water smoothing over stone, but only at the surface. Beneath that smoothness, the void she had left persisted. For Andrew, and for the handful of investigators who had kept her case alive in quiet ways, the silence was constant. Jasmine's file became one of many in a growing collection of unsolved cases. It rested in a worn folder on the corner of a detective's desk, under layers of paperwork, always near but never quite buried. The official status read, "Inactive, pending new information." A bureaucratic euphemism, a phrase that really meant, unless something dramatic happens, this case is going nowhere. Then, in late summer 2019, something did happen. The news came in fragmented headlines and urgent bulletins. Another woman had gone missing while hiking alone, this time in a national forest more than 100 miles south of where Jasmine had disappeared. The pattern was eerily familiar. Solo, experienced, careful. Days passed. Then the story took a darker turn. The woman's body was found after a week-long search, buried in a shallow grave, not far from a well-traveled section of trail. The scene was gruesome. She had been assaulted, possibly stalked. The burial site was crude, a rushed concealment. Yet no viable forensic evidence was recovered. No DNA, no fingerprints, no security footage from any nearby access points. The killer had left chaos but no trail. No suspect was identified. To the public, it was a horrific anomaly, a terrible act in a wild place. But in a climate-controlled office inside the regional cold case unit headquartered in the state capital, one man noticed something more. Detective Marshall Wallace was not a dramatic man, but when he read the case file, a cold flicker stirred in the back of his mind. His work often involved looking at things other people missed, recurring patterns in crimes separated by distance, time, and even classification. Technically, the new murder case was beyond his jurisdiction. But Wallace's protocols required that every major act of violence be cross-referenced with existing cold files. He opened Jasmine Kensington's case. At first glance, they couldn't have looked more different. Jasmine's story was a void. No evidence, no confirmed sightings, no signs of violence. The newer case, by contrast, had a crime scene so stark in its brutality that it practically screamed. But Wallace couldn't dismiss the similarities. Both women were alone, both experienced, both targeted in remote forest areas. The newer killer had been confident, meticulous. Was it possible Jasmine had been his first? A test run? One where he learned how to leave nothing behind. It was a stretch, a whisper of a theory. But it was more than anyone had come up with in 2 years, and it was enough to reopen Jasmine's file. Wallace and his partner arranged a visit with Andrew. They drove through winding back roads, arriving at a modest home tucked at the edge of town. In the living room, they sat across from Andrew. A framed photograph of Jasmine rested on the mantel, her radiant smile seemingly watching them, frozen in time. The detectives explained the disturbing connection, the possibility that Jasmine hadn't been lost to the wilderness, but to a predator. Andrew said nothing for a long while. His face went pale. His eyes seemed to fix on something far away. The idea was like acid to the heart, offering a conclusion, but a monstrous one. Next, they met with Nathan Caldridge, Jasmine's friend and the man who was supposed to have gone with her. The meeting took place in a quiet corner of a local cafe. Nathan looked different, thinner, older. Grief had left its own mark. He'd quit his job at the architectural firm not long after Jasmine vanished, saying the memories had become too sharp. When the detectives presented their theory, Nathan froze. His hands shook slightly as he held his coffee cup. His eyes brimmed with guilt. Jasmine had gone alone because he'd fallen ill. And now they were asking him to consider that she may have been murdered. possibly by someone who could still be out there. Wallace, always observant, asked Nathan to walk them through the hours before Jasmine left. Again. Nathan spoke slowly. They had dinner together. They had been excited. Later that night, he'd been hit with violent food poisoning. He spent the next day immobilized, mostly in the bathroom. He mentioned something about visiting a local urgent care clinic, something he had briefly shared in his original statement 2 years ago, but no one had followed up on. Wallace leaned forward. "Do you remember which clinic?" he asked. Nathan nodded without hesitation. "Yeah, West Creek Family Medical." "Would you be willing to sign a release so we can obtain those records?" Wallace asked, keeping his tone casual but measured. Nathan looked up, the sadness in his eyes edged by resolve. "Of course. Anything that helps. Do you really think that's what happened to her?" Nathan's voice trembled as he asked the question, his eyes pleading for a truth the detectives weren't ready or able to give. They offered careful, practiced reassurances. Nothing definitive, nothing cruel, just quiet, professional neutrality. The truth was, they didn't know. They had theories, they had fears, but no certainty. Not yet. The very next morning, the urgent care records arrived. Wallace and his partner pored over them with clinical attention to detail. The timestamp was clear. Nathan Caldridge had checked in at 10:15 a.m. on the very day Jasmine left for her trip. The attending physician's notes were meticulous. Acute gastroenteritis, consistent with food poisoning. The file described severe nausea, dehydration, and treatment involving intravenous fluids administered over the course of several hours. Nathan had paid with a credit card, the receipt embedded in the clinic's digital system. There were no inconsistencies, no gaps in the timeline. His alibi wasn't just good, it was ironclad. Just like that, the faint wisp of suspicion that had surrounded him vanished. Like the scrap of turquoise fabric found years earlier in the thorns of a creek bed, this lead dissolved into nothingness. Nathan Caldridge had not harmed Jasmine Kensington. He wasn't even close to her location at the time. He had been too sick to stand, much less stalk anyone through the woods. But despite the dead end, the inquiry had served a deeper purpose. The investigation into Jasmine's disappearance had undergone a quiet but monumental transformation. The once dominant theory that Jasmine had fallen victim to an accident, an injury, or perhaps even a wrong turn that spiraled into tragedy, was now pushed aside. The detectives no longer saw her as a hiker lost in the woods. They now believed they were chasing something much darker. In their minds, this was no longer a recovery operation. It was a manhunt for a phantom, a predator, a faceless figure who might have used the vast wilderness as cover to commit a perfect crime. The Appalachian Mountains, once seen as a harsh but beautiful place where a person could vanish by misfortune alone, took on a new hue in their imagination. They no longer seemed merely indifferent. They seemed complicit, an accomplice to something cruel. The case file for Jasmine Kensington didn't spring back into action. There were no raids, no arrests, no dramatic courtroom breakthroughs. But its internal classification changed. Subtly, it was now filed under suspected foul play, a shift in status that carried real weight within the cold case unit's hierarchy. Then the file went still again. 4 more years passed. Technology changed. Databases became more interconnected. Digital forensics has evolved. But in the corridors of justice, progress often moved more slowly than memory. And Jasmine's name slipped further from public consciousness. She became a footnote in local archives, a cautionary tale among wilderness guides, and a whispered story shared at campfires along the Appalachian Trail. Until the morning of October 14th, 2023. It was a brisk, clear Saturday, the kind that paints the mountain sky in a sharp cobalt blue. In a rarely traversed section of the Appalachians, far from the tourist trails and weekend backpackers, 3 men moved steadily through the underbrush. Their pace wasn't casual, but focused. They weren't hikers, not in the traditional sense. They were seekers. Members of a curious and obscure collective calling themselves the Appalachian Geological Survey Group. They were weekend scientists of a sort, enthusiasts of Earth's unseen forces. They weren't after elevation gains or sweeping vistas. They sought the invisible, magnetic anomalies, seismic murmurs, and electromagnetic peculiarities hidden beneath rock and root. Their leader, Marcus, was a meticulous 40-year-old with a background in IT and an insatiable curiosity. Slung from his shoulder was a high-end EMF detector, a sleek device with a black casing and a glowing digital readout. The Latinx AF5000. It was state-of-the-art, capable of detecting even minute fluctuations in electromagnetic fields. For most of the day, the screen had shown little more than the expected hum of the planet's natural magnetism. Faint pulses, background noise. Then, without warning, it screamed to life. Marcus stopped dead in his tracks and held up a hand. The others, Ben and Leo, froze behind him. Marcus stared at the screen. The numbers were jumping, 22, 47, 63, climbing fast. A bright red bar on the graph spiked. "Something's here," he muttered. They looked around. No power lines, no structures, no radio towers, just forest, just mountains. He took a few steps left. The signal dropped off. A few to the right, it climbed again, stabilizing at a powerful 87 milligauss. The readings were intensely localized, disappearing almost instantly once he stepped outside a 5-foot zone. It wasn't natural. Not even close. Geological anomalies didn't behave like this. Driven by instinct and the pull of mystery, they dropped to their knees and began to clear the area. Using gloved hands and the heels of their boots, they peeled back layers of decomposing leaves, branches, and forest soil. After several minutes of effort, they exposed something odd. A crevice. Not wide, not dramatic. Just a long vertical crack in the earth, like the mountain had been sliced open. Roots twisted around it like skeletal fingers. It exhaled a steady stream of cool, damp air. Marcus held the EMF meter over the opening. The signal didn't waver. 87 milligauss constant. They stared into the darkness, collectively feeling that peculiar tug, the moment when curiosity outweighs caution. This was why they did what they did. After a quick, tense conversation, they agreed Marcus would descend first. He had the most climbing experience and had packed for vertical exploration. They anchored a safety rope to a thick, living tree nearby. Marcus strapped into his harness, adjusted his helmet, and clicked on his headlamp. The beam cut a white slash into the black below. With a deep breath, he lowered himself into the crevice. The descent was narrow at first. Jagged walls pressed close, cold and wet against his jacket. But after about 10 feet, the fissure widened dramatically. He stopped, dangling in open air, suspended above a cavern so vast that even his powerful lamp couldn't define its limits. He turned slowly, panning his light across the space. The walls glistened with condensation. Water dripped somewhere in the depths, echoing faintly. The air was utterly still, untouched for centuries, maybe millennia. He pointed the light downward. There was no floor, only darkness, a vertical void. His voice, when it came, echoed up the rope. "It opens into a massive chamber. I can't see the bottom." Ben and Leo called down to him, asking if it was safe. He steadied himself against the wall and swung slightly to change his angle of view. Then, something caught the light. Far below, at the edge of the pit's perimeter, perhaps 60 or even 70 feet down, his beam fell across something that didn't belong, a sharp contrast against the stone, a flicker of color. Not natural, not mineral, fabric. A small splash of synthetic material is clinging to the rock. Red. No, orange, bright, faded, but unmistakable. A cap? His voice cracked through the silence. "There's something down here." Marcus narrowed his eyes and focused the beam of his headlamp on the curious splash of color far below. It looked like a jumble of fabric, possibly a sleeping bag, and another shape beside it, perhaps a pack or tent. His mind immediately conjured an innocent explanation. An old prospector's site? Maybe remnants from a long-forgotten expedition? The mountains had seen centuries of human passage. It was plausible, if unusual. But it didn't account for the anomalous electromagnetic readings. That remained the real mystery. He slowly ascended back through the narrow fissure, his limbs burning with effort, the rope creaking softly with each movement. When he reached the surface, Ben and Leo reached out to help him. As Marcus pulled himself free from the harness, his face bore the unmistakable look of someone mentally racing through possibilities. "There's definitely gear down there," he told them, panting lightly. "A sleeping bag, maybe a pack, but it's deep at the bottom of a huge vertical shaft. There's no way the signal from my EMF reader is coming from down there. It's too far." He tapped the screen of the device, which still registered a strong pulse. "The source has to be near the entrance," he added, driven now by equal parts curiosity and unease. Marcus returned to the mouth of the fissure, this time with deliberate precision. He moved slowly, sweeping the EMF meter along the rock face, examining each crack and crevice with a surveyor's patience. The numbers flickered erratically until he reached a small, dry alcove carved into the inner rock wall, positioned just about chest high. The EMF meter screamed. Its digital display locked onto the number 87, the exact same reading that had drawn them here. Marcus set down the device and reached into the narrow pocket of stone. His fingers brushed against something cold and synthetic, rigid plastic with squared corners. It was tightly wedged between two stones. With a bit of effort, he pried it loose. Sunlight revealed the object's form, a small, portable two-way radio, a weathered walkie-talkie. The casing was scratched and stained, the surface dulled by exposure. It was dirty but unmistakably intact. The three men stood in a stunned triangle, staring between the device and the black crevice behind them. This wasn't a natural occurrence. This wasn't just about magnetism or geology anymore. This was something else. A human had been here, and they had left this behind. The realization hit them all at once. This was a deliberate placement. The radio had been hidden, shielded from the elements, yet still powerful enough to emit the strange signal that brought them here. And paired with the gear Marcus had seen at the bottom of the pit, it painted a picture that none of them could explain. "We need to call this in," Marcus said, voice low. He reached into his pack and retrieved a satellite phone, the kind they kept in case one of them got injured far from help. His fingers trembled slightly as he dialed 911. What followed was a blur of movement and rapid escalation. Law enforcement was dispatched immediately, understanding the significance of a call like this from deep in a remote mountain range. The responding deputies arrived with a mix of caution and urgency, climbing the trail and securing the site with professional precision. Their boots crunched over the leaves as they took statements, their eyes scanning the fissure with growing concern. Marcus recounted the entire sequence. What they had been doing, how they'd found the anomaly, what lay below, and where they had found the radio. One of the deputies radioed for backup and forwarded the coordinates up the chain of command. Within a matter of hours, Detective Wallace was en route. The name Kensington had surfaced in the relay, and the moment he heard it, he requested the case file. By the time he arrived, the area was already being transformed into a tightly controlled staging ground. He recognized the scene immediately. The gear, described in Marcus's account as a sleeping bag and a beige hiking pack, matched the inventory Andrew Kensington had provided back in 2017. Wallace stood at the edge of the fissure, his coat tugging slightly in the same cool draft that had escaped the crack. His gaze lingered on the radio, now sealed in a clear evidence bag and carefully catalogued. Despite its size and simplicity, the object radiated implications. It was not just a forgotten device. It was a beacon, a hidden voice calling from the past. A specialized cave rescue team was brought in that afternoon. Trained in vertical rope rescue and subterranean extraction, they operated with mechanical efficiency. Their setup was elaborate. Anchors driven into the bedrock, a web of pulleys strung between trees, brightly colored ropes against the forest's subdued tones. Their mission was clear: descend safely, retrieve the gear, document the scene meticulously, and assess whether further exploration of the cavern system was needed. Two of the CRT members, geared in helmets and harnesses, descended into the abyss. Their headlamps shimmered against the wet stone walls, and their radios crackled faintly as they relayed updates to the surface. "We have a visual on the items," one voice finally reported. "One blue sleeping bag, one beige frame backpack. Both appear significantly weathered." They moved carefully, taking high-resolution photographs before disturbing anything. The backpack was unzipped, its contents slightly spilled, a mess that looked neither hurried nor neat. The sleeping bag lay unrolled, as though someone had used it recently. But the most important detail soon followed. "No remains," the second rescuer confirmed. "No bones, nobody." That report hit the surface team like a second wave of mystery. Wallace exchanged a glance with one of the deputies. The cavern had given them something tangible at last, but not the answer everyone had feared. Jasmine Kensington was still missing. The gear was carefully packaged, tagged, and lifted back to the surface. Andrew Kensington had arrived just minutes earlier, driving all night after receiving the call. When the evidence was brought up, he stepped forward, slowly. He didn't need to touch it to recognize it. "That's hers," he said, voice barely above a whisper. His eyes locked on a faded patch sewn onto the backpack's strap. "She made that. Hers." Wallace placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. The question that had haunted them both for 6 years, what had happened to Jasmine, had just grown stranger. The walkie-talkie was sent to the State Police Forensic Lab under urgent priority. It landed on the desk of Sarah Nguyen, a lead technician in digital forensics. She examined the radio like an artifact from a lost world. Scratches along the sides, corrosion around the battery hatch, mud dried in the seams. She expected it to be long dead. But when she connected it to her diagnostic console, a flicker of power lit up the screen. The battery still held a charge. That was the first red flag. Standard alkaline batteries degrade quickly. 6 years of exposure to fluctuating temperatures and moisture should have rendered them inert. But this one had power left. It wasn't alkaline. It was lithium-based, longer-lasting, more durable. Sarah opened the device carefully. Inside, she found the batteries intact, but something even more curious. A faint manufacturer's imprint indicated the batch had been produced only 3 years prior, not 6. 3. Whoever placed that radio had done so well after Jasmine disappeared. The batteries inside the recovered walkie-talkie held a disturbing secret. They were not 6 years old. According to Sarah Nguyen's forensic assessment, their condition indicated a far more recent installation. After conducting a full diagnostic sweep, she determined, conservatively, that the radio had been actively powered on and intermittently transmitting for approximately 12 to 18 months. It hadn't sat dormant in that crevice since 2017. It had likely been placed there during the spring or summer of 2022. When Detective Wallace received Sarah's detailed report, he stared at it for a long time, reading it twice, then a third time, just to be certain he wasn't misinterpreting the implications. They were staggering. This wasn't the scene of a long-forgotten hiking accident. This wasn't the tragic end to a backcountry misadventure. Someone, possibly Jasmine herself, had been alive in the cave system a year and a half ago, and if that was true, then everything they thought they knew was wrong. Jasmine hadn't fallen into the pit and died in 2017. She had survived, or been held, long after the search parties had stopped looking. It was a narrative-shattering revelation, a shift from the finality of presumed death to the chilling ambiguity of continued life, and possibly continued suffering. The official posture of the investigation changed almost overnight. What had for years been treated as a cold case missing persons file was now reclassified as an active search for a living individual. The fissure, once dismissed as a tomb, had become a threshold. The ground beneath it was no longer considered a static location. It was now the mouth of a vast, dynamic network that might have concealed a secret for years. Wallace immediately commissioned a full spelunking survey. A professional team of speleologists was contracted, cave mapping experts equipped with 3D scanning gear, LiDAR tools, and aerial drones fitted for subterranean navigation. They descended into the darkness with a clear mandate: map every tunnel, chart every crevice, illuminate every blind spot. The work was slow and exacting. The environment was treacherous, the terrain unpredictable. What they uncovered astonished everyone. The fissure wasn't just a pit. It was merely the tip of an underground iceberg. Beneath it sprawled a multi-chambered labyrinth, an intricate system of caves, tunnels, and stone halls winding beneath the forest floor like the veins of a forgotten beast. Some passageways were barely wide enough to crawl through. Others opened into wide vaults the size of parking garages, echoing with silence. Laser scans revealed miles of passages, many of which had likely never been touched by humans before. And yet, there were signs. Faint scuffs, a few footprints, a piece of torn nylon fabric caught on a rock edge. 2 weeks into the survey, the team made another stunning find. Hidden in a densely vegetated hollow more than a half-mile from the fissure, they discovered a second entrance. But this one was not narrow or perilous. It was a broad, arched opening, easily large enough for a person to walk through upright. The floor sloped gently inward, leading into a tunnel that joined with the larger cavern network. It was clear, navigable, safe. A paradox. If Jasmine had been inside this cave system, why hadn't she used the obvious exit? Why had her gear been found at the bottom of a sheer drop instead of near the accessible entry? And who had placed the walkie-talkie as a signal years after she was believed dead? The contradictions were maddening. The investigators realized they were chasing a story filled with deliberate misdirection. Jasmine's disappearance was no longer an unsolved tragedy. It had become a long-form enigma, unfolding in chapters they couldn't yet read. With the possibility of Jasmine having been alive as recently as 2022, the investigative lens refocused sharply. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't nature. It had been orchestrated, if not in its origin, then at some point along the way. Someone had kept her hidden. That meant Jasmine's disappearance likely had a human cause. And if so, the focus had to return to the people in her life. The circle was small. Jasmine had always been somewhat private, a woman of few but meaningful connections. Her closest relationships centered around her brother, Andrew, and a small number of work friends, including her old hiking companion, Nathan Caldridge. Andrew was quickly ruled out again. He had been her advocate, her voice, her tireless champion. Every action he'd taken since her disappearance had been focused on finding her. His life had stalled in that moment. His grief had never faded. That left Nathan. The name had once been cleared. In 2019, his alibi had seemed airtight. Clinic records, timestamps, and corroborating staff. But now, with a radically different timeline and a more sinister premise, the context had changed. Wallace didn't relish the idea of revisiting a closed lead, but the circumstances demanded it. What if Nathan hadn't participated in her disappearance, but had been involved in her continued absence? Could he have known where she was all along? The idea was speculative, grasping, but Wallace couldn't afford to dismiss it. He assigned a junior detective, Rebecca Ainsley, to conduct a complete forensic audit of Nathan's life from 2016 onward. Every bank record, social profile, vehicle registration, and location tag was placed under scrutiny. For weeks, Rebecca sifted through a mountain of digital data. At first, everything was normal. Nathan had changed jobs once. He'd relocated from the city to a quieter suburb. His social presence had dwindled. He lived quietly, alone. But then, she found something. In early 2017, just months before Jasmine disappeared, Nathan's financial situation had taken a steep dive. Credit card records showed frequent cash advances taken from casino ATMs. His bank accounts registered several large withdrawals and strange deposits that didn't match his salary. Debt collectors had begun pursuing him. He was, by every measure, spiraling. He was drowning in gambling debt. Suddenly, motive bloomed. Could Jasmine's disappearance have been a twisted financial maneuver? Investigators began speculating. Was there an unclaimed life insurance policy? A trust? Had Nathan orchestrated a disappearance, believing he could cash in, only for it to spiral into something more complex? The food poisoning that had kept him from hiking with her, was it real or a manufactured alibi? If he had planned it, had he confined her in the cave system, maintaining her existence for reasons unknown? Was it control, money, madness? It sounded far-fetched, like a crime thriller rather than real life. But Wallace had learned long ago that truth often wore the mask of fiction. The case had twisted again. And somewhere beneath all of this conjecture, one fact remained immutable. Jasmine Kensington had not died in 2017. And if she had been alive in 2002, here was still a sliver of hope. The theory required layers of deceit, timing, and an almost cinematic level of psychological manipulation. It painted a picture of a man capable of orchestrating years of deception, and yet it clashed with the image of Nathan Caldridge, the quiet, grief-stricken architect the detectives had met. But motive was motive, and financial desperation could unearth a darkness in anyone. Detective Wallace knew that they couldn't afford to let discomfort or assumptions cloud judgment. He arranged a second interview. This time, the conversation wouldn't take place over coffee or in a public setting. Instead, Nathan was brought into a secure, soundproofed interview room at the county sheriff's office. The space was sterile and impersonal. Gray walls, a metal table, and 3 chairs under unforgiving fluorescent lighting. Across from him sat Wallace and his partner, a younger detective whose presence added weight to the room. Nathan walked in, cooperative but uneasy, the shift in venue not lost on him. The questions started civil, routine. But as Wallace steered the topic toward the walkie-talkie discovery, the recent forensic report, and the new timeline suggesting Jasmine had been alive into 2022, Nathan's demeanor changed. Confusion first, then defensiveness. His eyes darted between the two men, trying to read where the line of questioning was going. Then Wallace slid a folder across the table. Inside were printed copies of Nathan's bank statements from the months leading up to Jasmine's disappearance, each page marked, every withdrawal and charge highlighted. "We know about the debt, Nathan," Wallace said, his voice calm but firm. "The cash advances, the casinos, the collection calls. You were drowning, and you didn't tell anyone, did you?" Nathan flushed. His eyes stayed on the folder, as if willing the documents to vanish. "That was a long time ago," he said. "I had a problem. I got help. I moved on." "How?" the second detective asked. His tone had none of Wallace's practiced patience. "Did Jasmine know about your gambling? Did she confront you about it? Were you worried she'd find out?" Nathan's face contorted. "No, she didn't know. I didn't involve her. It had nothing to do with her." The room's energy changed. The tone of questioning escalated. The pressure mounted. Could he have faked his illness that weekend? Was his visit to urgent care part of an elaborate alibi? Did anyone see him the night Jasmine left? Was it possible he'd arranged to meet her afterward, only to disappear her? Nathan broke, not in confession, but in raw frustration and disbelief. "I didn't hurt her," he said, his voice cracking. "I swear to God I didn't. I loved her like a sister. I made bad choices with money, but I couldn't." He buried his head in his hands. Wallace watched carefully. He had seen lies before, but this didn't feel like that. They already knew most of the answers. The file from urgent care had been thorough. Not only had Nathan checked in that morning, paid with a traceable card, and been treated for dehydration, but Wallace's team had also re-interviewed the attending physician. a now-retired doctor with a sharp memory. The doctor remembered Nathan's case precisely because he had documented a rare presentation, acute onset of vomiting with dangerously low electrolytes. "You can't fake that level of dehydration," the doctor had said. He needed fluids, and fast. Even more telling was the financial trail. The digging had uncovered a turning point. In late 2018, Nathan had received a modest inheritance, just under $50,000, from a great-aunt in Vermont. The probate documents were public, the checks were traceable, and the timing made sense. The influx of funds had cleared his debt and allowed him to relocate. After 4 hours in the interview room, the momentum of suspicion ground to a halt. There was no deception to unravel. Nathan Caldridge was a man with a deeply flawed past, but he wasn't hiding a crime. He had been pulled into the mystery not by guilt, but by proximity to someone who had vanished into myth. When he left the station, pale and shaken, Wallace felt the creeping familiar weight of disappointment. They had pursued the theory to its natural conclusion, and like so many trails before it, it vanished into mist. The elaborate narrative of a long-term abduction fell apart, thread by thread. What remained was a hole, a chilling, unanswered question. If not Nathan, then who or what had been responsible? The investigators regrouped. They had exhausted every human angle. Jasmine's brother had been thoroughly vetted. Her co-workers had long since moved on. There was no shadowy stranger, no pattern of stalkers. Every plausible suspect had been eliminated. There was only one thing left to question: the cave. The initial search had focused on rescue and recovery. It had looked for signs of Jasmine, living or dead. But now Wallace ordered a second phase. This time, it would be a forensic reconstruction. They weren't just looking for Jasmine, they were looking for her story. The team assembled was unique. Forensic technicians with years of experience in crime scene recovery joined forces with speleologists and environmental scientists. Their goal wasn't just to search. It was to read the cave as one might read a burned journal, scanning for faded ink between the pages of ash. For days, the crew worked beneath the harsh white glare of portable floodlights, carving the main chamber into a grid. Each section was excavated gently, soil lifted in small batches, sifted and catalogued. They treated the space like an ancient ruin, a place where memory was buried in dust. Their breakthrough came near the second entrance, the wide arched doorway hidden beneath the trees. In a recessed alcove just out of the airflow, they discovered a ring of blackened stones. Charred ash sat between them. It was a fire pit, primitive but functional, a hearth. Its shape was tight and practical, designed to hold warmth, to cook small meals, to ward off cold. And it wasn't just used once. The ash held layers, dark strata formed by repeated burns. Different types of wood, some long scorched, others more recent. This was not the mark of a traveler. It was the pattern of someone living in that space. Near the pit, they uncovered bones, tiny, brittle, long cleaned by time. Squirrel, rabbit, even a few bones from birds known to nest in caves. A forensic biologist examined them under magnification and confirmed they had been processed. Tiny notches, breaks consistent with cooking. There were also sharpened sticks nearby, simple tools, fire-hardened at the tips. Spears, or at least hunting implements. Someone had lived here. Not just survived, lived. The implications were as chilling as they were awe-inspiring. Jasmine Kensington, or someone in her place, had carved out an existence beneath the earth. She had hunted, cooked, slept, fought for survival in a way that few could even comprehend. And then, at some point, she had vanished again. They were primitive implements, fashioned not by expert hands but by necessity and sheer determination. Hardened in the flames of a makeshift fire, their sharpened tips spoke volumes. These weren't just tools. They were weapons of survival. Spears or skewers, crafted from broken branches, blackened and toughened by heat. Someone had used them to hunt, to cook, to stay alive in a place where the mere idea of survival seemed impossible. This discovery shattered assumptions. The clues now pointed not toward a swift and tragic end, but to something far more astonishing, a prolonged, brutal, and nearly impossible endurance. The investigators, stunned by what they were piecing together, slowly began to outline a radically different version of events. This was no longer a missing person case about a hiker lost to the elements. It was a chronicle of someone who had fought nature tooth and nail and managed, against all odds, to persist. It likely began with a fall. Jasmine, disoriented or misled by an unseen hazard hidden beneath the dense green canopy, may have stepped where the earth simply gave way. The 60-foot drop into the dark, vertical shaft should have ended her life. But her pack, well padded and tightly secured, acted as an accidental cushion, softening the impact just enough to keep her alive. She wouldn't have escaped unscathed. Far from it. Internal injuries, broken bones, maybe a fractured rib or two, a concussion likely, but breathing, conscious, alive in the dark. In those first few moments, hours maybe, when shock dulled the pain and survival instinct surged forward, her mind must have raced. She had one connection to the outside world, her two-way radio. It became the focal point. Perhaps she'd pulled it from her belt and hurled it upward with a burst of adrenaline, praying it would catch a ledge or land close enough to the surface to transmit a faint signal. Or maybe, in a feat of desperate strength, she clawed her way partway up the jagged shaft and wedged the device into a rocky crevice before collapsing from the effort. Regardless of how it got there, the radio had done its job. 6 years too late. She had bought herself a lifeline, even if it didn't reach anyone in time. Back at the bottom, she was surrounded by absolute blackness, her flashlight becoming the only barrier between her and total sensory deprivation. Each flick of that beam carved the darkness into pieces she could understand. She likely rationed its use carefully, dreading the inevitable death of its batteries. She had food in her pack, but it would run out quickly. Her sleeping bag offered warmth, but not safety. The pain must have been unbearable, but slowly, as days bled into weeks, her body mended. It wasn't comfortable, it wasn't humane, but it was life. As healing progressed, so did her will to act. She must have begun crawling, feeling her way along the rough walls of the cavern, always searching for a break in the stone, a passage to somewhere else. And in time, she found it. A second entrance, a hidden blessing, wide enough to walk through, angled enough to be gentle. She stepped into the filtered sunlight for the first time in weeks, blinking, dazed, and broken, but free. This discovery was the missing puzzle piece. It explained the fire pit, the animal bones, and the sharpened stakes. Jasmine had found a way not only to survive, but to adapt. She learned how to live off the land, how to hunt small forest creatures, use wood to make fire, and fashion tools with crude precision. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was enduring. The cave that had once been her prison had transformed into her shelter, her stronghold. And yet, this theory birthed a tormenting contradiction. If she could walk out, why hadn't she gone back to retrieve the radio? Why hadn't she used it again? Why hadn't she made her way to a town, contacted her brother, reclaimed her life? The likeliest answer struck like a cold wind. The batteries in her flashlight had died. Once darkness swallowed the cave again, she would have lost all orientation. To navigate back to the vertical shaft without light, over jagged rocks and uncertain ledges, would have been nothing short of suicidal. The radio was gone to her, a beacon forever out of reach. So she chose to stay out. She left the device, the sleeping bag, and the remains of her past at the bottom of the pit and walked away into the Appalachian wilderness. Not to civilization, not to rescue, but into a new form of isolation, a ghost in the woods. And that begged the final question, one more haunting than all that came before it. What happened next? Because Jasmine never reappeared. She didn't contact Andrew. She didn't withdraw from her accounts or renew her driver's license. There was no trace of her in the systems of the world. It was as if she had chosen to vanish, or worse, had been taken again. That brutal murder in 2019, the hiker found in a shallow grave, returned to the forefront of Wallace's mind with a vicious jolt. Could Jasmine have escaped one death trap only to fall into another? Had she survived the wilderness, only to encounter a human threat far more lethal than the cave had ever been? For months, the cold case unit revisited every theory. They canvassed nearby towns, showed photos of Jasmine's younger face to gas station clerks, campground hosts, and rangers. Most had never seen her. A few thought they might have. But there were no definitive sightings, no fingerprints, no surveillance footage. The trail had gone cold. It seemed the story had ended again, not with a bang, but a whisper. Then came February of 2024, a ripple of pure, random luck. George Petrie, a retired logger and weekend naturalist, made his annual hike through a deep tract of private land he'd long kept for hunting and observation. As usual, he was collecting memory cards from trail cameras scattered along old logging roads and overgrown paths. He wasn't expecting anything dramatic. Just deer, maybe a bear or two. His cameras had never captured anything unusual. Until that day. Back at home, sipping lukewarm coffee in his cluttered workshop, George scrolled through thousands of clips. Grainy images of raccoons, a fox chasing a squirrel, a deer, graceful and alert. Then something different. A figure, slight, bundled in layers, moving quickly past the lens. The timestamp was recent, mid-December 2023. He leaned in closer. The figure paused in the frame for just half a second, looking up as if startled by the camera's motion sensor click. The face was partially obscured by a scarf, but something about the eyes, the hair, the angular cheekbones. George knew that face wasn't just unfamiliar. It was out of place. It wasn't a hunter. It wasn't a local. It was someone who didn't belong. He forwarded the footage to the sheriff's office with a brief note. This might be something. They ran the image through facial recognition databases. The results were inconclusive. The match percentages were low, but not zero. Wallace stared at the still frame for a long time. It wasn't proof, but it was a possibility. And for the first time in years, that possibility felt like hope. He was on the verge of swapping out the memory card from the final trail camera when something caught his attention. A flicker of motion buried deep within the archive. The timestamp in the corner of the grainy black and white footage read, August 14th, 2022, at precisely 4:52 a.m. The clip was short, just 15 seconds, but what it revealed would crack open the silence surrounding Jasmine Kensington's fate. The camera had captured a figure walking slowly down the middle of the old logging path. This was no animal. It was unmistakably human. The person moved with the sluggish but resolute rhythm of someone pushed to the brink of exhaustion, yet still driven by some internal fire. The frame showed a gaunt silhouette, draped in clothing that hung loosely, ragged at the seams, dark and indistinct in the limited light of the infrared sensor. Long, tangled hair spilled over their shoulders, matted from dirt and time. Then, as the figure passed directly in front of the lens, they turned, just slightly. A reflex, perhaps, to the soft mechanical click of the sensor activating. For a brief moment, their profile was clearly visible. The curve of the cheekbone, the contour of the jaw, the unmistakable shadow of strength and familiarity. It was her. Despite the hardship etched into every line of her face, it was undeniably Jasmine Kensington. George Petrie froze, coffee forgotten in his trembling hand. He had watched the news unfold months earlier about the shocking cave discovery, the bizarre electromagnetic signal, and the personal items found in the depths. He, like everyone in the area, had followed the mystery closely. Now, staring at his screen, he was looking into the eyes of that mystery. He played the clip again and again. On the third viewing, his disbelief gave way to action. He called the sheriff's department immediately. When Detective Wallace saw the footage, he didn't speak. For a long moment, he simply watched, absorbing the enormity of what he was seeing. A cold trail suddenly burned with vivid, unassailable truth. Jasmine had survived. She had made it out. The infrared timestamp confirmed what forensics had only been able to estimate. The spring or summer of 2022, exactly within the projected window based on the radio's battery lifespan. Wallace felt an overwhelming blend of vindication and dread. The mystery had not been solved, but its center had shifted. The impossible had been confirmed. She had been real, alive, walking. But where was she going? The location of the trail camera offered the final, heartbreaking detail. It was placed along a narrow logging route that twisted through the thick underbrush, not far from the cave's walkable exit. Just 20 miles separated that spot from the entrance they now believed Jasmine had used to reclaim her freedom. 20 miles of punishing terrain, steep elevation, and rough ground, covered by a woman who had survived catastrophic injury, starvation, and isolation. That journey alone was an epic feat. More striking still, Wallace noticed from old forestry maps that this same logging path connected to a remote stretch of paved state highway just 5 miles beyond where the camera had caught Jasmine's image. She hadn't been wandering. She had a destination. She had been heading back to civilization. 5 miles. That was all that remained between her and a road. A road where even one passing driver, one pair of headlights, could have rewritten the ending to her story. But it never happened. The trail ended there, swallowed again by silence. Wallace launched a renewed wide-scale public appeal. This time they had more than words. They had an image. That still frame of Jasmine's weary yet purposeful face circulated widely. Flyers were stapled to bulletin boards in gas stations and convenience stores across 4 counties. The footage was distributed to regional news outlets. Investigators retraced every possible route between the trail camera's location and the highway. They interviewed business owners, truckers, and farmers. Door-to-door canvassing swept the 10-mile radius beyond the last sighting. But no one had seen her. No one remembered a solitary woman walking a remote roadside before dawn. No 911 calls had been made. No hospitals had received an unknown Jane Doe matching her description. No motorists reported stopping for or even glimpsing a figure on foot. That 15-second video remained the final, irrefutable proof that Jasmine Kensington had made it out of the Earth's depths and stepped, one foot in front of the other, back toward the life she had been torn from. But whatever happened next, whatever occurred in those 5 remaining miles, was unknown, and perhaps unknowable. The case remained suspended, tangled in the agony of what-ifs. There are theories, of course. The most hopeful, though few investigators believe it, is that Jasmine chose anonymity. That, after all she had endured, she decided never to go back, that she started a new life, somewhere else, leaving her past behind like a shed skin. But Wallace finds that idea nearly impossible to accept. Jasmine had a brother who had never stopped searching. She had a life she had fought tooth and nail to return to. A woman who survived such pain would not, could not, simply vanish on purpose. No, the darker theory remains. That Jasmine Kensington survived the unthinkable, emerged from the earth, and walked straight into the path of something worse. Not an accident, not a choice, but an encounter with someone who saw a vulnerable woman alone in the wilderness and took advantage of her last fragile moment of hope. A predator, more dangerous than any wild animal, who did what the mountains could not. That her story, after years of unimaginable perseverance, ended not in the cave where it began, but on the side of a road where no one was watching, where silence once more claimed her.